Good morning. Welcome to this week's episode of the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. We are on the road today for County Seat. We're in Kane County at the Kane County Commission Chambers. The reason we're here is because of vegetation. I'm not talking about the gardens outside of the county courthouse. We're talking about BLM lands in the field office and on the Grand Staircase National Monument. They are in the process of working on a revegetation plan for this area to improve the habitat out on the rangelands. Now, how they do this will have a great deal of impact on exactly what the future looks like. How will it impact wildlife? How will it impact grazing? How will it impact the potential for wildfire? These are all issues that need to be considered. And we are going to look at this through the prism of county planning and local residents. So to get to that conversation, let's find out about how the process started and what the options are.
It's hard to talk about the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument without stirring up some controversy. Since it was announced in 1996, this 1.9 million acre land designation has been a contentious issue for Utah and the communities adjacent to the monument. The most recent discussion on the monument has been about grazing, as the BLM revisits its grazing plans for the area. Planning alternatives range from no change to completely removing grazing from the monument, with more realistic alternatives in between. The purpose behind such a wide variety of options has more to do with avoiding litigation, but the BLM admits there is value in considering many options.
It's legal because BLM has found that if a no grazing alternative is not included, it has been found in court that we did not include a full range of alternatives, and entities that are interested in seeing grazing retired instead of continued have made it clear that they will file for injunctions on the basis of there not being a no grazing alternative considered and evaluated. And then from the standpoint of just good analysis, it makes sense to include that as a full range of alternatives option in order to look at what the impacts really would be. And I have encouraged the local people who are concerned about that to look at this as an opportunity to see what would the impacts on the local economy actually be if they were to take grazing off the table. If we don't study it, we won't know.
Part of that controversy revolves around plans for revegetation on the monument. If you were landscaping your yard, you would decide what to plant and where to plant it. This is sort of like that, but on a monumental scale. Creating a vegetation plan involves more than creating landscapes suitable for just grazing, or just wildlife, or overall biological diversity. There are many other factors that need to be considered.
Active vegetation management will produce good ecological services. That means you'll have less runoff and erosion. You'll produce more forage and habitat for wildlife and livestock. And you'll get more biodiversity. You support your wildlife. But you've got to know what you're doing and do it in the right way as best you can. We're in a semi-arid environment. You get failures because of lack of precipitation.
If you look at the average cost of a Type 1 fire management team, that's the highest level of a fire management team that can come in to try to put out a fire. I mean, they could average, with aircraft costs, $1 million a day. And that's like a huge Yellowstone type event. Okay, here it's not going to be as much extensively. The benefits for that at $300 an acre versus $1 million a day, you can't look at it any other accounting way. That this is going to stop a fire, it's going to save somebody's house. And that's one of the big things it buys us from a fire standpoint, is it buys us time. And if we've got time, we have time to save resources.
Everyone who looks at the landscape sees its future differently. Ultimately, the plans involving vegetation on the monument will relate back to the decisions that will impact grazing.
I think the more areas you have that are not grazed, then you have good comparisons, and you have then permittees who can see, oh, this is what it could be.
BLM staff acknowledges that grazing is a beneficial use, as well as part of the culture.
Oh, definitely. From my perspective as a socioeconomic specialist, I see ranching as an important part of the local culture, and it also is a contributing factor to tourism because people do come here hoping to see cowboys.
There are still many considerations and differences of opinion on this revegetation plan that need to be settled. Chad will get into the weeds, so to speak, with our panel discussion. For the county seat, I'm Derek Dowsett.
An interesting lesson learned from the field trip is that you can manage vegetation for both wildlife and grazing. In fact, the BLM's own staff acknowledged that the time of year they graze and what they eat makes it so that you can cover the range and have it be compatible for both big game and for cattle. Well, you've gotten a landscape look at the vegetation issue here in southern Utah. When we come back, we'll get to the root of some of the problems and challenges on the county seat.
There are a couple great things about the Uinta Basin. One is it's still small, it's community.
That makes you feel like when you go somewhere, you know everybody.
When you know your neighbor knows you, and you can trust each other. People look out for one another.
I grew up in the Uinta Basin, and I think that it's a good place to raise a family.
So we packed up our 3 kids, and here we came to Uinta County, and what a great place it was.
It's not too big, it's not too small.
And it has a lot to offer that you just don't get in the big city anymore.
There is a place where the desert comes alive, where rain breaks forth from solid stone and gardens spring from blistered rock. There is a place with enough color to make a rainbow jealous, where boulders are bigger than buildings and cliffs are higher than clouds. There is a place that will straighten your step, tighten your grip, widen your eyes, and open your jaw. There is a place.
The weekends just never feel like they're long enough. By the time you get to a destination, you're worn out and you may need a vacation to recover from your last vacation. The solution is closer than you think, and that's just what you need. You can find the desert at Little Sahara, the cool refreshment of Yuba Lake, escape to the green of the forest on the Nebo Loop. Make your escape to Juab County. It'll change your family forever.
Welcome back to the county seat. We are discussing the Grand Staircase, Kanab Field Office, southern Utah, basically revegetation of the lands out here. Joining us for a conversation today, Harold Hamblin, who knows the land real well. He's a rancher down in this neck of the woods. Lamar Smith, who has come all the way from Texas as a consultant for the county and can give us a perspective of somebody who really understands vegetation, and County Commissioner Jim Matson from Kane County. Thank you for joining us. So I want to start the conversation by looking at the field trip people saw some clips from just before this commercial break. There were recurring themes in the conversations that came out. What is overall the consistent theme throughout these lands as far as vegetation and the need to do something with it?
It would seem that after decades of benign neglect, we've gotten ourselves to a point where we have nothing really out there to talk about except old growth Pinyon Juniper, which is just occupying those sites that otherwise would have been productive from the standpoint not only of the landscape, its health and water yields and watershed health. It's time we start taking a look at what should occupy those landscapes and who the beneficiary should be. So I'd like to expand that some more if we could.
No, I think that's the main thing, that throw the erosion in there that is just eating part of the land up and taking it down Grand Canyon. But I was on that field trip too, and I felt like their own experts said that revegetation is the way to go, and that we need to move in that direction. And if they took a look at what the field office has done with theirs, they're moving ahead with it, and the benefit that it's doing not only for the rancher, the grazer, but for the recreationists, for the deer hunters, for the sportsmen. The other day up to one of those sites, I helped pull a gentleman out that was stuck in the sand, and he had cameras hanging over his neck. He was down taking pictures of bugs. There were bugs all over in that thing. And he was having a good time seeing what had moved in to those areas since the Pinyon and Juniper were taken out. So I do think that's the big one.
Lamar, what are some of the impacts of this overgrowth of Pinyon Juniper? I mean, obviously it obscures the landscape and and the undergrowth kind of disappears, so forage goes away. But isn't there a water impact to those as well?
There is. This is something that's occurred pretty much throughout the West. It's not just here, that the juniper and some other shrubs have increased over the years. And when they increase, they compete for moisture with the grasses and forbs that grow underneath and reduce that cover. And this has two main effects. One is that, as I think Hal mentioned, it reduces the effective ground cover to help prevent erosion or slow it down at least. And the other is it reduces the general diversity of species and habitats for wildlife and so on. You get a uniform sea of juniper with very little underneath it. You've got almost a biological desert.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting way to put it, because there's not much that goes. Now, obviously the BLM has done some project. You just mentioned 3 before we started airing this program. What have they gotten right so far?
Well, I think when they went out and did the buckskin and the 5 Mile project, where they chained some trees and stuff, and where they reseeded and put that back in, that vegetation is coming good. The problem with that is that it took a fire to get them to move on it, to get it going, because of the diversity of all the pinyon and juniper and everything in there. It burned, so they had to go in and do something to stabilize the soil. And I think that's the frustration that we as ranchers feel with the whole thing, is the process takes too long, too much study, too much bureaucracy to get it done.
Good, and that's a good point to take a break. I'd like to delve into that a little bit further, and we're going to take a commercial break. You're watching The County Seat. We're discussing revegetation down in Kane County and the public lands out here. We'll be back right after this quick commercial break.
The Bear Lake Valley is a beautiful, rural, historical, and recreational paradise. The changing of the season makes now a great time to come our way to see the warm colors of fall in contrast with the cool blues of Bear Lake. Visit us in the Bear Lake Valley. Come for the ride, stay for the adventure.
Welcome back to the County Seat. We're talking about revegetation down on the BLM lands in the southern part of the state. And I say that because you've got the field office and the monument, and that distinction causes a lot of confusion and sometimes cross-management. Let me ask this question, because you set us up for this, Mr. Hamblin, before we took the break. And that is, what are the concerns that you have with the process as it goes forward? Any of you?
Well, one of the concerns I have is that if we can go in and redo the old existing seedings, a lot of them were done before NEPA came in, but they've been done and they're needing attention there. And the biggest one that we have, some of those can be saved by spike or by herbicide putting on to kill some of the brushes and forbs that are coming in that are invasive to that area. It wouldn't do much for the pinyon and juniper because you don't want to put that much on, but aerial spike would bring a lot of those back. Well, in the policy, they can't do that. There can be no aerial spike. You can put aerial spike on mechanically on the ground, but they won't let them fly on. that's one of the big ones for me on that area, along with the part that it just takes years to study. We study, we study, we study. When a lot of the NEPA was already done on the buckskin when that burned, it was already there. They could have moved right in and done it, but they had to do another one. They had to, it seems like they have to cover so many bases before they can move. And the difference between that and the field office is the field office says, if we don't try, it'll never get done. And if we don't try, we won't know whether we can do it. But the monument is slow to try.
What are your observations on this whole process?
Well, I agree with him on some of the restrictions that have been put on the use of herbicides and whether you could fly it on or not fly it on. I think some of these really don't make a lot of sense. If you ought to do what is most effective and economical and makes it possible to get it on at the time it should be there with minimal impact to other things. I mean, an airplane, after all, doesn't disturb the ground or anything. Then another issue deals with the use of introduced species for reseeding, and there's a lot of antagonism toward this now, based on the fact that they were not native here, and really that. The decision there ought to be to reseed what will grow,
what will work,
what you can get.
And that's interesting, because even some of the people that were experts within the BLM were actually quite supportive on that field trip about exotic, what they call exotic species, which are the non-natives that they would bring in, and they had to admit they actually worked really well at quickly rehabilitating the rangeland.
Yeah, well, a lot of the native species are really not. They're adapted to the area, they're adapted to survive here, but they're not adapted to reseed quickly. In other words, the opportunities for them to seed may come along once every 15 or 20 years, depending on the rainfall conditions and so on. And these other species are you're just more likely to get a stand and get some ground cover out there that's useful, both in terms of erosion and forage for livestock and wildlife.
So they have different alternatives that they're looking at what to do. And I think it probably would be instructive for people watching the program to talk about who's competing for use of the rangeland and how does that affect what you plant.
You know, there's so much pressure today and awareness of public lands, and whether it's through the media or through our educational system, but we've actually gotten ourselves to the point to where the agencies are at a spot where there's too many disincentives to do anything. And it just locks up the process. And the easiest, simplest thing for a land manager to do is not to have any controversy. And when you've got competing interests like that, they have expectations, whether you're a non-governmental organization that's oriented toward membership and fundraising versus someone that's trying to make a living on the landscape, or a county that's trying to make sure that its citizens and from a social standpoint have the opportunities economically and the rest. All this stuff goes on at the same time. So it depends on who's really got the best rationale and the best funding to get their way in this thing. So we get far away from whether or not we're talking about the ground anymore. We're talking about the biopolitics of land management.
And it's very interesting, on this grand run that's going on right now down here. When they staked out their trails, they wanted to go up through these places that had been revegetated. That's where their trails are running, is where the people wanted to go. They didn't want to go out into the nothing but pinyon and juniper and look for a flag to run to in that area. So a lot of the trails on the Grand are up through what the field office has done up here on the Coral Pink Sand Dunes.
Well, I guess that's one good way to attract recreation to your area.
But off the monument.
Yeah.
And on the field office.
So what do you plant? What do you plant to sustain wildlife and to promote grazing? Because that's traditionally the use of the land out here is grazing. So what is the best mix? How do you approach it?
Lamar, take that.
Well, I think the best mix is going to depend on the kind of soil, and in other words, the rainfall level and so on that you have, and probably it's the same ones they planted some years ago. Those seedings were in there for a long time. I don't know personally why they failed, whether it was drought, we've been in a lot of drought in recent years, and so they need to be rehabilitated, but they would probably be those and a few others, ones you could use in other areas.
There seems to be a consensus that there should be a mix, that you should have stuff so that you've got ground cover that's responding to all different kinds of environments. Is that good thinking?
I think we would put some shrubs in there now, which they didn't do in the past, I think. They were pretty much strictly thinking of livestock forage, but if there are some shrubs like four-winged saltbush and some of these that are useful not only for wildlife, but they're useful for the livestock as well. But I would probably put those in the mix.
One of the ones that the field office have done, they've put everything from wildflowers to browse to crested wheat and a tall wheat and a rice grass and a mix of things that not only helps grazing but helps the wildlife. It helps the person who wants to see the scenic beauty of it. And it's really a good policy because none of these projects take place without Sportsmen for Wildlife, NRCS. There's a whole group of people that want to see this happen, and yet there's an element that wants to see nothing happen.
So let me ask you this. I understand that. Let me ask you this question, Hal. If you're a rancher, and we've just had a statement saying, well, we've got wildflowers, which is not necessarily the first choice of a cow, and you've got some browse and some other things that go through there. Are you okay with that?
Absolutely. Anything that'll take pinyon and juniper and cut the invasive sagebrush and stuff down, we're for. You know, we're not in it for us, we're in it for the land. Mm-hmm. And if anybody wants to see that place production and produce, it's the rancher.
I think some of the opposition to using non-native species stems from this sort of balance of nature concept that we're going to restore it to what it originally was when everything was peace and harmony. And yet, interestingly enough, it's not what it used to be. It's changed for different reasons, and I think it's interesting that some of those people who want to restore it to what it originally was are the same ones that are biggest proponents of global climate change. And since climate is the major driving force there, obviously if the climate's changed, you're not going to put it back exactly the way it used to be. So we look at what can we get it to be now that suits our purposes.
And you said if it's changed. I think it's been changing, hasn't it?
Yeah, of course it's changed.
Yeah, all the time, all the way.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess our argument always is what's caused it to change, but this is a very good point. And it's also a good point for us to take a break. We'll be right back with the county seat. Stick with us. We've got one more block to kind of wrap this thing up.
Kanab, base camp for your southern Utah adventures. You belong in Kanab.
What would you do with an extra day in Utah Valley? Explore the Wasatch Mountains? Snap a family photo at Bridal Veil Falls. Cool off on Utah Lake or the Provo River. No matter what you're searching for, you can find it in Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
Sevier County is perfect. The brand new fairgrounds facility includes a large meeting hall, breakout rooms, and a perfect kitchen facility to feed just a few or hundreds. The county also boasts the Sevier Valley Center on the campus of Snow College Richfield. This facility includes an arena and numerous breakout rooms that can be used for any type of meeting, conference, or event. When planning your next meeting or conference, consider placing it in the center of it all. Sevier County.
Welcome back to the county seat. We've been talking about revegetation on the monument in the Kanab field office of the BLM. We've got our panel here. I guess I want to just take this minute to wrap up and say, what's the target we need to keep our eye on? What's the prize we're looking for?
Lamar mentioned earlier biological deserts, that our landscapes are turning into. But in reality, the opportunity out there is so that we can have the kind of landscapes where there are multiple beneficiaries. But hands off to that is not the way to do it, unless you want to burn it up. Otherwise, I think we stand a chance of losing it all. We ought to be doing some treatments and some things that make sense for a lot of different reasons. And I think revegetation is one of those steps.
So what are your thoughts on this? What's missing from the table?
Well, I think the biggest thing that's missing from the table, if you went to the Grand Staircase's tour, revegetation tour, 85 to 90% of all the experts in there said that revegetation was the thing we needed to do, the thing we needed to get going out there. It would help stop erosion, it would help stop the wildfire, it would bring back the lands. One thing we haven't talked about here is that's the Ponsagon deer hunting. It's supposed to be a trophy big game deer hunting, and it has gone downhill and downhill and downhill since the vegetation is gone. I think the sportsmen and the people of Utah are a win-win to get some of these projects going back on the ground. And we need to move quicker than 18 years.
What are your thoughts, Lamar?
Well, I think if we've learned anything about land management is that if you just try to protect something, just put a fence around it and don't use it, it does not accomplish your objectives. We manage wildlife, we manage the livestock, we manage the people, and we need to manage that vegetation and soil as well. And so just a protectionist viewpoint. Some of it's quite well intentioned, I think. It's a fear of some people that we will do some damage by our management, and occasionally we may. But most of the time, we're going to improve on the things that benefits all those uses that we've been talking about.
Well, usually Mother Nature fixes herself, does she not? I mean, if you guys make a miscorrection, you have the ability to fix it rather quickly, don't you?
You can, but we can't let Mother Nature do our management for us. That's Mother Nature is what's produced this situation we got right now.
She's a brutal manager because her clock is a lot different than ours. She can take 1,000 years to
and
fix
this balance of nature is not a continual balance. It's kind of like if you have one foot in a bucket of hot water and the other one in a bucket of ice, the average is about right, but that's the way it works.
Well, that's actually a very good point to operate up on this. Or if you'd like a little more information about our conversation today, please feel free to go to our website. We'll try and get some links on there so that you can get a little more in-depth information about what the county supports and what some of the people down here think, and some ways that you can participate in the process or at least become more educated about it. We thank you for inviting us into your homes each week to discuss these topics. They're important ones. And we wish that you would and hope that you would get engaged with us on our social media and share this with your friends. That's it for the County Seat this week. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on the County Seat. If you like this video, then we invite you to subscribe to our channel, The County Seat. You can do that here. And we invite you to share with your friends. We also invite you to get all the latest up-to-date information by following us on our social media channels. And if all else fails, make sure that you watch The County Seat Sunday morning at 8:30 right here on ABC4.